I am Nisa Floyd. I'm the program coordinator here at Atlanta Contemporary. And today we are embarking in the first panel of a series called Art as a Solution. The reason why we are creating a series as opposed to just these one-off conversations is because Atlanta Contemporary is partnering with the Urban Catalyst Lab to form a series that is rooted in accountability and actionable items. So it's not just about having a conversation, it's about what happens after this conversation. What are we doing as organizations to make sure that the solutions that we come up with today, we kind of figure out how to make those things happen? How do we embark on that journey? So the Art as a Solution panels, the first one is about advocacy and activism. The second one will be about climate change, and the third one will be about education and the discrepancies of resources that contribute to lower income areas and people of color not having access to different educational resources. So without going too far into it, I just want to announce our moderator. Ruxanda Renita is the co-founder and CEO of Urban Catalyst Lab, the Atlanta-based nonprofit that works on positioning and deploying art as a solution for smart and inclusive cities and an integrated component within urban planning. Through Art as a Solution, Ruxanda empowers artists to engage in urban planning and private sector governments and UN to utilize art as a process in achieving equitable communities and changing behaviors around complex topics such as climate change and social justice. I could go on and on about Ruxanda's authority on the topic of complex issues, but I think it would be best to pass the baton to her since she has over 8 years of experience in the public sector, leading a strategy and fundraising approach with the CDGs, change management, and people, public, private, and partnerships with a vast amount of organizations, both locally, regionally, and internationally. So I will pass the baton to you, Ruxanda. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Nisa. After such an introduction, it's hard to follow, but I'll try not to disappoint you guys. So as Nisa mentioned, we're super excited here at Urban Catalyst Lab to be partnering with Atlanta Contemporary in starting what we call the Art as a Solution panel series that will be focusing on unpacking the future of the art in the presence of interdisciplinary groups from tech to artists, to governments, to multilaterals like United Nations, and many more. So with each panel, we are aiming to unpack deeper this topic of what we call Art as a Solution ecosystem 2.0. It sounds very fancy, but the idea is that we're looking at the intersectional conversation. So not art in isolation, but art within tech, art for policy change, art for community change, the role of the artists as thought leaders, and so on, right? So today, as Anita mentioned, we'll be focusing on activism and advocacy in arts. Now, we have brought this very diverse panel, and I hope that the panelists are on camera now. We brought, obviously, the computational artist, Jessica Anderson, whose art you might have seen at UN and around the world. We have brought the community artist, William Massey, whose art, I'm sure that you have seen it around Beltline and in general in Georgia. He's very vocal in the community. He's working side by side with the community. And we have also the global leader and former architect and founder of Habitat's Asia Pacific office, Steve Weir, who probably doesn't need any introduction, especially within the United Nations setting. And lastly, but not least, we have the co-founder, the curator of the Black Women in the Arts, Lauren Harris, whose efforts are no stranger for anybody in Atlanta, but also in the US. She was the one who actually pushed forward for Black artist presence and professionals at the Art Basel, Miami, and many more. So because we brought this very interdisciplinary panel together, today we'll be looking at art, activism and advocacy in the arts from different perspectives. So we'll be speaking about the role of artists in activism and advocacy, and the way that activism and advocacy impacted the role of artists, right? And we'll be also speaking about the art institutions, how, again, activism and advocacy impacted it, and the other way around, how it can impact. So how can advocacy and activism impact the art institutions? And lastly, but not least, we'll be integrated more into the fourth industrial revolution, meaning how can we integrate frontier technology in this already complex ecosystem of advocacy and activism in the arts, right? So we hope, as Nisa mentioned, to come up with some very actionable items that you all can take back in your community to implement. So we also hope that it will inspire you all to reach out to our panelists for any ideas that you might come up with during our panel. So without going more into the concepts, I will just jump into the first question. So as I mentioned, activism and advocacy can mean many things. So some of the people might think that activism and advocacy is more this flashy posters and protest on the street, and we're not saying that it's not it, but we all agree here on the panel that activism and advocacy is much deeper than that. It's much more tactical, and it's sometimes more quieter and behind the scene. So especially when it comes to resolving issues like climate change and social justice, it takes a village and it takes a lot of strategy. So before we jump into more deeper questions on this topic, I want to ask you all, the panelists, as well as our viewers, to share with us some examples of activism and advocacy that you really look up to and inspires you personally. It can be connected to art, or it might be beyond that. So from our panelists, who wants to start first?
I'll go first. Well, the art behind me is inspired by kind of the answer to this question, because it's by Barbara Jones Ogu. She was a part of the Afro movement in the 1960s and 70s. And if you're familiar with the Black arts movement in Chicago, they were a group of cultural leaders and activists, poets, writers, musicians, who kind of spearheaded and used their talent as a way to be activists in their community. So this is just one of my examples that I'm a fan of.
Wonderful. So we have an activist from Chicago. Now, William, why don't you go next?
Sure. My mind immediately went to JR, the French Parisian artist, in his piece that he did at the US-Mexico border. So at the border wall, he set up a table that actually kind of penetrated the border from a bird's eye perspective. And there was a lunch, a picnic that was had on this table, which was a work of art, a photograph in itself viewed from a drone. And so from the top, it looked like everyone was at the same table sharing the same meal, even though in reality, they were in two different countries with a massive steel barricade in between them. And it was just visually stunning and kind of broke down these societal and physical barriers from an arts perspective. I loved that piece.
Mm. You know, I was honestly thinking about a couple of pieces at the Mexican-American border as well. There's a Mexican-Canadian artist named Rafael Lozano, and he did this installation whereon it was at El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, and on either side of the border, they installed these really large spotlights directed up into the air, and they could be like turned around and repositioned and moved around. And then, so there were 3 on each side of the border. And then when any of the beams of light touched, what that would do is open up a 2-way radio connection between the 2 stations on either side of the border, and people were able to talk to one another. And then also when people were talking, the beams of light, they would pulse with the cadence, the voices. And so, yeah, there's another, the border pieces are really, really powerful, I think.
You both have outlined some very interesting multidisciplinary interventions or installations that include both the community and, in your case, also the technology. Mm-hmm. And this is definitely a nice segue to Steve, whose background is very much in urban planning and urban design. So I'm curious what your example is, Steve.
Well, actually, I was thinking some things that were not visual per se. So I love the inauguration poem last week. It was very powerful from an advocacy perspective. She is an amazing poet. But I also think about, I think I lived in Asia for a long time, and I think about how it's different in different parts of the world. Singapore is a very modern, industrialized, completely modern city, but very rigid with its political and civil rights. And so there was an op-ed writer when he lived in Bangkok. There was an There was an op-ed writer who pushed the boundary of what was acceptable to the ruling government. And one day he pushed it too far. And so they had him fired from the newspaper. But his readership was pretty broad and they liked that he pushed the boundary. And there was a rule that said that you had to have a parade permit to protest or to have any sort of meeting of more than 4 people. And so what they did is they all wore the same t-shirts and they mobilized like flash mobs at all of the MARTA stations, the metro stations, but they were 4 people, not 5. They didn't carry any signs, but they had the same color t-shirts and they didn't say anything. So they technically couldn't be arrested, but they would walk and they would stand in front of the entry to the train. And so they really slowed down the whole kind of morning commute. But it was it was a protest that sort of bent the rules or got through the rules. And I think it's really interesting how in different cultures, what an artist has to do in order to get their point across.
This is beautiful. So each of you have brought some very different perspectives of art, activism and advocacy through the arts, through organized sort of mobilization with the community. We also brought slightly the idea of artist as a thought leader, right, and community organizer. And so we will probably unpack some of these topics within our conversation. But since we're all Atlantans from our panelist perspective, and we are currently in Atlanta, and I can say that as a global citizen, I consider that activism and advocacy is part of Atlanta's DNA, and that's what really attracted me to this city, especially when it comes to the intersection between activism and advocacy and the arts. I think that that's unique to Atlanta, but that's my bias, sort of way of thinking. So I want to ask our dear Atlantan artists, if you as artists are identifying yourself with Atlantan artists or with artists of the entire world as a whole. And of course, a secondary question might be, do you really think that activism and advocacy is part of the Atlantan artist's DNA or identity? Or do you think that activism and advocacy is part of being an artist identity, whether it's from Atlanta or around the world? So who wants to go next, William or Jessica?
I would say I identify very much as an Atlantan and very much as a Southerner. And so I think that we like, I make design and computational work and a lot of using technology with art. And I think that that's often sort of conceptualized as very global. And in one way it is, because that's what we use to have other global experiences is our computers. But I think there's also like an overlooked potential for the expression of local and regional culture and identity through technology that I think a pretty special quality.
Please keep this thought because we'll come back to it again in the conversation. This is beautiful. I mean, this regional perspective and technology and the arts and how technology is not necessarily this global, tool that many of us think that it is, but it can be, and it is regional as well. So that's very beautiful. Did you want to add something else to this answer?
I was thinking about what you said about is this sort of activist approach part of who we are as Atlanta artists? And I don't know. So I want to have some thoughtful about that, but I'm really turning that over because I tend to think that that's inevitably a part of every artist.
That's a good thought. Very good. So I will turn it to William. Let's see what William says. What do you think, William?
From the perspective of an individual artist in Atlanta, I can't say that I often ponder or recognize my connection or Atlanta's connection to the international art world. Whether I am or not, I guess I just don't consider it much. But if I had to think about it, it's like, no, I don't feel like I'm an international artist. I feel like I'm an Atlanta artist, maybe an artist in the Southeast United States. Now, when it comes to whether arts advocacy and activism is inherently Atlantan or vice versa, I think that it can be, and it isn't always necessarily. While I do think that just like the act of creation is a form of advocacy, whether it's for self or for freedom of imagination, or whether it's inherently advocating for other people or a bigger picture, I think personal or communal, I think it is that. But whether it's purposefully that is really just from artist to artist, case by case. But for sure, Atlanta's history is has a huge foundation of arts and advocacy and activism. And I think about Sweet Auburn and the movements birthed from like the spiritual center of our city, kind of our nation, and in part the world. Just like I think the work of the SCLC and the Poor People's Campaign was a creative form of advocacy and activism, and all the folks who took part in that. And that's just one of many things that has happened here and is a part of a bigger story from Atlanta. So yes, there is that in Atlanta, and I want more and more to see that expand and grow, and it's a beautiful legacy.
William, you brought a very interesting perspective that you spoke about activism and advocacy from an individual perspective and from a community perspective, because artists can play both roles, right? So that's a very interesting one, and I hope that we'll come back to this again within the conversation. Now, I'm curious, so you spoke about your perspective as an artist about activism and advocacy, and especially as Atlantan artist. Now, I'm curious what Lawrence thinks, because Lauren is a curator and also an activist that pushes for equity in the art institutions of Atlanta and the South. So I'm curious if you, Lauren, think that activism and advocacy, if this is really part of Atlanta's DNA, and especially Atlanta's art DNA.
Oh, I mean, for sure. There's so many grassroots and bootstrap efforts that have happened in the city, especially in the last year, with my community of the Black arts community really boosting mural projects and activation street projects and really helping to identify with what's going on in the world today. But I don't think it's the one thing that's unique to Atlanta is that I still feel as though, even though we have the Sweet Auburn Mark and there's pockets of activism in Atlanta, there's still a lot of siloed and segregation activities happening in Atlanta. And I do think that's unique to Atlanta, but there's several cities around the country who, maybe have solved some of their artistic issues, their issues with the arts and connectivity with the community. And I think Atlanta still has a long way to go in terms of we shouldn't have to continue to bootstrap and grassroots and DIY our projects. It should be a larger support and larger community effort from institutions and the community.
This is very interesting what you mentioned now, because you do agree that activism and advocacy is part of Atlantan DNA. However, you brought up a very complex problem in terms of the art institutions, as in the ecosystem and the silos that exist, either from a neighborhood perspective or institutional perspective, and how it can impact sometimes not as positively our activism and advocacy efforts, right? So how do we surpass that? So again, through the conversation, we definitely will unpack that further. That's a very interesting point. Now, Steve, you mentioned from the very beginning that you, as in global citizen, but also Atlantan, have spent a lot of time outside US, in Sri Lanka, in Thailand, right, as well? Yeah, how many years? 20 years or something?
Just about, yeah.
Wow, so you are really global here, basically. And you have a very good understanding of how to integrate local to global, global to local, local to regional. And I'm curious from your perspective, do you see activism and advocacy part of Atlanta's identity? Or through your experience as an Atlantan, as a planetary man, as a global citizen, do you see some sort of similarities between activism and advocacy in the arts abroad as well as here? Are there some similarities, or it's completely unique to Atlanta. So we want to hear from you.
So I think it's a little bit of a complex question. I mean, just like politics, people say all politics are local. I would say you could argue that all art is local as well. So I think about the civil rights movement in Atlanta and how Atlanta-based that was, but how much it resonated beyond Atlanta, as William was saying. I remember being in Jerusalem and we were going through the Palestinian state, and right on the border at the checkpoint, there's a giant mural of a peace dove with an olive branch in the beak, wearing a flak jacket and a helmet. And it was very moving to think that every day, and that was a statement that the Palestinians were trying to make to the tourists who went back into Israel, that they lived in a different place. And it was true. The other side was like a developing world, a third world country in the way, just the other side of the wall. And so I do think that mural wouldn't resonate in Atlanta, but it totally resonated in the Palestinian state. And it was a transformation of perspective from tourists who might come from Atlanta to the Palestinian state in trying to understand how it was the same and how it was different. But both Atlanta and Palestinians had and have had and continue to have civil rights issues. So, I think the UN defines human rights as civil, political, social, cultural, economic, and those 5 are probably true everywhere in the world, but they're expressed very differently. But I think they talk to each other. And as we've said with the Urban Catalyst Lab, wouldn't it be cool if we could have artwork that not only talk to each other in different places in the world, but through which people who engage with that artwork could actually talk to people in other places in the world at the same time. So I think, like I said, all art is local, but I think there's a lot of similarities.
That's a very beautiful thought. And again, we're not running away from complexities. We're getting even more complex with each question. But in other words, activism advocacy is local, but also global. So local as in, there are some cultural dimensions that speak to us here as in the residents of this space, right? And then there are some components that are beyond that transcend everything. And like Steve mentioned, well, the equity, the civil rights pieces, it is something that transcends Atlanta, right? It's a global issue. But in the same time, there are some cultural perspectives that speak just to us as Atlantans or as Palestinians. So that's a very beautiful metaphorical thought. So, and this, since we're now jumping into the arts deeper and deeper, this takes me again back to our artists, William and Jessica. And you guys, I mean, you each have used art in a very different way. Your practices are completely different. So you, William, are sort of transforming the streets into what I call the future museums. And in doing so, you engage the communities, meaning not necessarily as an art community, but community as in residents that live in that space, that work in that space. And you co-create with them the future art installations. Now, you're doing that without taking away from what we call the aesthetics of the fine art, right? And then now you, Jessica, you're working with computational art, right? And you are utilizing this, I guess, futures of data-driven and engagement-focused technology in your art to sort of maybe even elevate further this connection between the art and the viewer, but also to expedite or accelerate some of the impact that we can do on complex issues like climate change and you name it. And again, you're doing that without taking away from what we call the typical fine arts, the aesthetical piece, right? So I'm curious if you both can elaborate on your practice of art, whether it's the process or the product, in achieving change. And of course, it's up to you how you define change. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to speak for a few minutes. Working with computational elements is always a little bit more complex and a little bit different, I guess, than traditional artwork. And computation makes so many different kinds of interactivity possible. And it can engage so many different materials and senses at the same time. You know, we have like an endless number of sensors and any material that we can dream up that we can activate computationally. So there's so many different possibilities. And so I don't know what happens in people's brains exactly, but our physical experience seems to be one of our, like, I think of it as like our last, like collectively accepted true authority is we trust our direct experience. So to show somebody an idea that engages this sort of direct experience and that engages our bodies and the way we are in physical space, I think that's particularly impactful and has a chance to be very persuasive. You know, we have these like novel interactions, like motion sensors that control visual art that's projected on the wall. So that's like a very novel interaction, and it invites people to experiment. And so when that's the sort of initial conditions that are set, where viewers or interactors are sort of primed to be in a playful state. And when you're in a playful state, then you're open to new ideas. And so I think of installation art a lot as like this safe microcosm for play and experimentation in things that we may not have felt before. And I think that's a unique opportunity to feel new things together socially outside of the rules of public engagement. So I think it's a rare way to have connected social experiences. And to me, also, the last thing I'll say is that we use technology to develop so many tools for violence and consumerism. You know, that's like the amount of like progress and development that's been made technologically for those goals is just out of this world. But we haven't even come close to imagining how those same tools might be used in a different way for creativity and connection and like human feelings and experience, right? So I think that like the effort has to meet our reality, I guess.
You've brought some very interesting ideas. So one that I really captured, and it's very curious to me, it's that the point of truth of today is our physical experience, which in a way is very selfish as well. It seems we as humanity have a little bit forgotten about the community experience and are more sort of egocentrically thinking about how we as a human are experiencing something, right? The me sort of moment. But what is curious, you also mentioned that what if we repurpose that, let's say, something that might be seen as not as altruistic and good in our, acceleration or in our progress as humanity for a good cause, and actually use this perspective to influence and help people understand complex issues, knowing that this physical experience is what helping them to understand complex issues. So that's very interesting. And you also spoke about how technology and art can create this playfulness. Mm-hmm. And this playfulness is what helps us as people to think beyond our inventive, narrowed niches of the way that we're thinking of this world or ourselves or our community. So these are very interesting points. And I'm really curious now, William, what you are thinking from your perspective, since you completely differently work within your art practice, right? And you approach art and the process completely different from Jessica. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on your art practice and your mission or not of creating change.
Yeah, I'm sitting here just thinking how closely related at least Jessica and I's work is, despite it couldn't be more opposing of a process and end product. Yet it is kind of the same. We're getting at the same kind of human condition and connection. So when it comes to my art achieving change, like my thoughts on that are, the goal is never change. Like, at least the goal isn't my vision of change. So going into community or into a workshop or creative connection session, the goal is very simple. It's provide freedom to let people, like, do what Jessica said, open up a bit of their playfulness again, because that just strips away societal barriers, whether the things that we've built up to protect ourselves or out of just innate self-centeredness that we all humans share, or to break down hierarchies and classes and separations between people. Like, it's so exciting that something as simple as color and line and form and scribbling can literally turn us into kids again. Kids who can be less worried, kids who can make friends faster, kids who can analyze and freak themselves out less just by overthinking things. And that leads to change, but the change is just the byproduct. It happens as a result of the point, which is like allowing ourselves to be creative, to be free, to see what comes out of our imaginations and our minds when our hands just go. So process driven for sure. And it's really all been birthed out of, like, art helped me. Art helped give my life purpose and meaning. And it kind of like saved me from doing what I thought the world was telling me I should do. And it opened me up to, like, what is good inside of me that I can build and share. And the first step of, like, getting that out was going to a cancer center and sitting with someone, because I just figured who's having a shitty time in life, and maybe art could help them like it helped me. So I went there, and it all just kind of spiraled outward from there. Like, how can we get people having a higher quality of life? And then the byproduct of doing that together is that we become more unified. Like, a businessman can sit next to a homeless man, and they can relate through just how silly it is to, like, scribble on paper. As a bare minimum, it's like human connection. And then the next time they engage someone who's different than them, it's a different experience. It's changed. Yet I'm not manipulating that change. I'm just, like, letting the goodness flow as best I can.
So you brought a very interesting perspective too. You're speaking about artists as facilitator. So you're not imposing change, you're listening, right? You're an active listener. Mm-hmm. And you are allowing them to co-create whatever change they want, if they want to change, or like you mentioned, sometimes it's just more of a healing process, right? Event experiencing. And you also spoke about the process and how, in all of this perspective, whether that's a community, as in a street, or like you mentioned, a cancer center, it is this inclusion piece, right? Because you're allowing them to participate in your world of the artist together with you, without imposing anything, but co-creating side by side. And also bringing these different stakeholders, whether that's a politician and businessman or, well, just a citizen of this city, together and being all at the same level. They have to forget their own sort of status quos or levels within their society or community and together. So that's a very interesting perspective. So you're speaking about how art as a process, it's liberating us of these projected societal barriers or identities that we're taking every day. And connecting us as humans, right? That's beautiful. And in your practice, do you think that, you kind of spoken to the process. Do you think that the fact that a lot of your art installations are in the public space, do you think that it's an important perspective of connecting with the community as well? Or do you think that the process is the most important? It can be in the public space or not?
I think they're both equally important. I think they just happen kind of in sequence. So for sure, art equalizes us when we sit down and humble ourselves to know that we're not Da Vinci. And And I think the kind of outdoor public museums, future museums, if you will, like you mentioned, also equalize, they democratize, they like give equal access to these experiences in ways that sometimes galleries or museums don't or can't. So I'm a huge fan of letting the people have their art. And I think Atlanta is an amazing place for that. You can't walk 60 seconds in any direction without seeing some sort of public art or mural. And that's for anyone to enjoy. And yeah, I mean, there's no greater way to make sure that art is there with people and for people than to put it out where people are.
So you brought up another very interesting perspective, democratization of the arts, how this is not a bourgeoisie sort of good, but it's actually here for everybody. And I think some organizations in Atlanta were saying it's a human right, right? So in other words, how this art is co-created with communities, for the people. So sometimes we forget that, and that brings me to Lauren. Since Lauren, you're part of the art institutional gang, and you are here to, of course, you're as an activist, working towards creating change, focusing on equity from an institutional perspective. You've heard what our Atlantan artists are saying about the role of art and the connection to activism and advocacy. Now I'm curious, you as a curator, as an activist, what would you like to for the arts to do in the intersection to activism and advocacy in an institution?
It's a big question, right? I mean, the list is long to me, but it was interesting because as I was, thinking about this question, there was an article released by Americans for the Arts yesterday where they pinpointed the fame that Amanda Gorman got from her speech, from her poem that she did at the inauguration, right? But on the other side of that, they said, well, there's 63% of creative workers who are out of work from 2020. Mm-hmm. There are creative workers who lost half of their income in this last year. There is just a really, as much as she got that platform and the fame that she's received from that, the arts are suffering. So we're continually used to use our voices to make change and to, activate people, but we're also not appreciated in the same light. We're also not funded. We're underfunded in many communities. And institutionally, whether it's a government institution, private institution, an education system, we are continually used as a blanket, as a Band-Aid, as a way to soften a voice or maybe activate somebody, but it's never fully funded to me. It's never appreciated in the way that it should. And I think we need more institutions to realize that, to me, art is all the things that even William and Jessica said. It's community, it's connectivity. Artists can be used to speak on issues, experiences, cultures, and it should be accessible to all in different ways, whether it's a gallery or museum, but the museum and the institutions to do the work to actually use the voices of the people that are in their community to speak to that community. Institutions to do more work in making sure there's equity amongst the onlookers that come into their space, the people that are around them. That's pretty much it. I mean, the list is long. I can go into specifics, but I just think generally if we are intentional about doing actual equitable work and inclusive work in each institution, no matter what type of institution you are, the art will be more accessible to all and not just the elite and not just the privileged.
So that's very curious as well, because I was asking what artists can do, and you're telling me what art institutions should do. I like that.
Artists are doing the work. I mean, the artists aren't, the creatives aren't the problem. We are doing the work. We're producing. It's the recognition. It's the money. we're here. There's artists that are here doing the work and putting themselves out there and speaking for their communities. But it's the institutions and the people and the gatekeepers that are in place that are keeping it down and not funding it and not giving more opportunities and space to artists to really create and allow their voices to be heard. There's been situations when I've been in where artists are creating work and they submit to have their work displayed. Oh, and somebody says, oh, it's too Black. Oh, it's too confrontational. Oh, it's too this, right? So there's people that are still keeping voices down. Artists are doing the work. Art is not the problem. It's the people that have control of where it goes.
I really like that perspective, because what you're saying is that the artists are already they are integrating activism and advocacy. They are doing wonderful pieces of work. They are proactive, but the art institutions are falling behind. Not only art institutions, but in general institutions. So whether we're speaking about corporations, governments, per se art institutions. Now, what would you like them to do? So I have actually quite a bit of questions for you from our audience. That earlier you even mentioned that there are silos here in Atlanta and beyond when it comes to collaboration between art institutions. And there are some questions for you that are basically asking you how, if you have some examples of cities that succeeded to, get rid of those silos and collaborate together. And like you mentioned, creating this space, inclusive space for the creators to actually be valued because they're already doing wonderful work, but so that there is a sustainable ecosystem of artists that do that work to support it, to elevate it, right?
Yeah, I think two examples I can think of, it's not off the top of my head, but Denver, I was speaking to a representative that worked in the arts from Denver, Colorado. And she said before she left, the commission there actually created a penny tax for consumers when they buy a ticket in the arts, when they purchase art, that part of the taxes from that purchase goes back into the arts ecosystem, right? It goes back into, and it funds projects and programs within their community. That to me spoke volumes. That's something that Atlanta can do because we have the money. And I think that would bring together communities if one, encouraging people to go outside of their neighborhood. I think there also is an issue with publicly putting the information out there publicly for all. Our commissions should do more work about putting out what is available in these communities. There should be more connectivity and not different festivals in different neighborhoods, but we should have more activity bridging those gaps. Another way to do it is public artists to me is always a way to do it, and to go into the communities. If these government institutions come together, such as the commission, such as West Atlanta ARC, they're doing the research behind it. But now it's like, we know it's an issue. So if somebody isn't aware of Zuccotti Gallery, but they're aware of Dad's Garage, where's the disconnect? What is the disconnect? What are we doing to continue that disconnect? So it's just really finding that issue. But it goes down to also people being intentional about going outside of their comfort zone, about going outside of their community. But also, this is to me, an effect of gentrification. You put, people in different neighborhoods, and they don't know how to connect to that neighborhood because they're new to the space. So we just have a bigger issue around, our economy in Atlanta that separates that together.
Now we're going into more complexities again. So it seems like, there are several issues that you talk about. One is, but basically, you talk about how all the institutions, governments, nonprofits, you name it, need to create, a more inclusive ecosystem. And it seems like there needs to be some sort of a catalyst to put them together. I guess it might be us, it might be our audience, it might be all of us. And then, you also spoke about the urban planning as a whole. So the neighborhoods and how that also can be part of an issue, and how some of the neighborhoods have access more to the arts than the others. Why, right? It shouldn't be like that. And how do we democratize all of this? And he also spoke about the idea of creating a fund that brings to the table all our institutions, and it's totally focused on the quote unquote people-centric art, right? And people-centric experiences and artist-centric, right? So these are all wonderful ideas that we definitely need to capture in our action items. Now, back to William, when you speak, you have walked us a little bit through your process of creating art, and you did, I think as an outsider, I can say that what is unique to your art is not only that you find the discarded objects, or as we like to call it in sustainability, recycling objects, to repurpose them, give them a second chance to create these art installations, but you also give a second chance to the people. Like you mentioned, you created inclusive space where people that from that space where this art will be installed are sharing their stories. And you're starting this healing process, right? Now, in 2019, I guess, or 18, I always confuse the years. I think this inclusive progress and process have helped you to be brought in front of the Johns Creek mayor's office, the mayor himself, and the city council, right? It was a unique moment because you, for your process, have not only brought up the different parts of the city, right, that were disconnected, but or maybe not, but you also have brought together the city council themselves, right? That's quite an achievement for an artist. So you were in a way the catalyst for the future of the city from an urban design perspective, from an urban planning perspective, from an identity perspective. And I'm curious, what were your thoughts in that unique moment? That's one thing. But secondly, what were some pieces from that process that we'd like to be replicated with other governments, including our dear government here in Atlanta, but also any other government around the world? What would be some piece of advice on how they should be working with the artists in helping them resolve some very unique problems, whether it's identity, lack of social cohesion, transportation, you name it?
So just to restate what you already said, I was charged with the task of gathering with a municipality, leaders and community members of Johns Creek to help form a community art project there. And this was a big jump for me, obviously, both with method and organization, because most of my stuff up to that point had been kind of boots to the ground. I just show up with a box of art and some trash and we make stuff happen out on the streets. Whereas since this was a bit more formal and more strategic, it was totally out of my comfort zone and I loved it. So, I going into Johns Creek, having grown up in the suburbs of Atlanta, not necessarily that suburb, but I just figured it was another suburb of Atlanta and okay, what am I getting into? And I mean, the meetings that we had, open community meetings with equally arts interested people, as much as people who were totally against using government funds on this public art project. Oh, wow. And I was charged with the task of listening and helping to facilitate conversation with the assistance of Urban Catalyst Lab and our team. And it gave me chills and goosebumps, A, because I didn't know what I was getting into, and B, because the people who came to the meeting with all sorts of opposing views, were getting excited and sharing stories. Well, first of all, I had no idea that Johns Creek was the most diverse city in Georgia, and I think top 3 or top 10 in the nation. So I was learning immediately, but then members of the community, when I was asking what's so special about the history of Johns Creek, what's happened here, and there were stories about everything. I'm from when the Native Americans were the only ones here, all the way up until the tech boom. There were these stories that were being shared that no one knew about. One person knew, different parts of the history, and everyone's eyes were just bursting wide. I had no idea. It was this process of forming a work of art was a process of people getting to know the place that they've lived for decades. So that was really special. And then, of course, it was really gratifying to be able to take countless stories and voices, somehow weave them together and make a meaningful work of art that was created with the community. And then in the end, when different, the core members of community of the city council came together, we had this ribbon cutting and all that stuff. And again, it was still half of the people at the start of the process did not think government funds should go to arts whatsoever. And the other half were still loving it. And they were coming together well, this is this is great. Like, this was an enlightening experience. And every single step of it was a 1.5 year long process. Every single step of the process was that, well, like, through participation and being a part of this, we see how vibrant and how important it is for our city and our community and for me individually.
You spoke a lot about the community, right? And how participatory this is and how long the process was, because it was around 2 years now, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So now I'm curious, from a government perspective, what would be your advice to governments, right?
Sure.
How do they work with artists? Because, definitely an example, like you mentioned, you brought the government together, but at the beginning they weren't very supportive. I mean, there are some naysayers out there, just saying.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the two words that come to mind, I don't know if they are spoken of much in government, or at least enacted much, and it's trust and faith. Like, what was special about that experiment, if you will, with Johns Creek was that I didn't have a sketch going into it. Like, this is what you're going to get. I promise it'll be good. We entered into an agreement of like, we're going to figure this thing out together. And like, you can look at my work and the work of the organization to make sure we've done good work, but like, we got to start the process if it is truly derived from community, and you got to have trust and faith that we're going to do it with excellence and inclusion. And we don't know what it's going to look like, but we assure you we're going to work our tails off to make sure it's representative of the whole and of where we want to be in the future too. And I think that's hard for governments to wrap their heads around. Anyone, really.
You're basically speaking about how the governments should be more open in collaboration with artists and art institutions, or I see here in the chat, they're speaking quite a bit about collaboratives or groups of artists. So they should be more open to that and allow them the freedom to co-create with their community and engage them in the process as well. But they have to have this trust that something wonderful will come out of it. They shouldn't, I guess, not belittle, but minimize or narrow the scope of the artist, right? Allow the artist to be a facilitator, a community leader. So that's very wonderful. And I hear a lot of questions in the chat, and I definitely will allow Nisa to share with us some of the comments from our audience and some of the questions. Nisa, I know that you were burning to share something with us, and I'm still not there. So go ahead.
No worries. There were just a couple of questions I wanted to highlight, which is one of them is from Grace Kim, who asked, she says, I'd love to hear about, I also assumed your pronouns, and so my apologies. I'd love to hear about the guest artists' experiences of the learning curve and remodes of community engagement, oral history, interviews, surveys, meetings, presentations. What advice would you give fellow artists in bringing more equitable and empowering communities engagement process and practice? So essentially, what advice do you have with creating those community engagement process pieces to help the infrastructure that Atlanta doesn't have and needs to facilitate? And I think that's also a question that can be asked to Lauren as well. You spoke to the lack of infrastructure in Atlanta, and you work with artists and have shared that you are doing a lot of programming on the streets. And so what infrastructure is necessary, and how do we create relationships so that that can be sustained?
Often, I guess I would say, go through organizations, and I don't have that sort of experience like William does.
Well, you have the experience in organizing with the organizations, which will come back to this one. So
yeah, exactly. That's the thing. That's why.
Why don't we go to William now? Yes, since all the hands are pointed to you, William. Sorry.
I heard Steve getting ready to talk too.
Okay. Well, why don't we give some time to Steve, and then William, you take it from there.
So my experience is really, my career is mostly with Habitat for Humanity, which is a very community engaging approach. And our founder used to say that more people change their way, they act their way into a new way of thinking rather than thinking their way into a new way of acting. So I think putting the emphasis on acting, engaging, rolling up your sleeves, doing stuff is a part of the equation. The other part is I can remember we work on community design workshops where we have a small group of architects will come in, but the community leaders come in, the community members comes in, and we cut out, cars and lamps and playgrounds, and we have them break them into groups, and they organize the site in the way that they'd like to see. The light goes here, the playground goes here. We want a meeting center here. And then we have several different groups that do that. So that's really a hands-on, and it's really more of a picture. It's not the final design, it's a picture. And that picture and that process gives you, through that conversation, that dialogue, you understand what it is that's important in the creation. And then the architects go away and they come back with a couple kind of more refined representations of what they heard in the moving around exercise. And so it's an iteration. I think it's an iterative process is part of it. I know, William, that was part of your process as well, yet an iterative process. And I love that you talked about trust and faith. If I could just share a quick story. I had a friend fiance, they both lived in Chicago, and she finished her education degree, and she had her tuition waived if she agreed to teach in a tough place in Illinois. They assigned her to a really tough neighborhood in Chicago, and she was so upset that she thought that, I'd rather pay it back than to actually go into that neighborhood and teach. And my friend said, no, let's go, let's just drive down there and see what it's like. And she said, I don't know, it's a scary part of town. And so as they're driving down, they're several blocks away from the school. And she says, stop, turn right here. He was shocked. What do you mean turn right here? She said, this is my street. And so they turned right down the street. They went about 6 houses down. And then you could see there were some new habitat houses that had been built in the last several years. And she said, stop here. This is my house. She jumped out of the car. She ran up to the front door. The people opened the front door. They threw her arms around her. She'd worked on that house as a college student. She was there multiple times working with her friends and the new friends that she made in the neighborhood. And they co-created something together that was an identity for every single person in that neighborhood. The volunteers, the people that live there, we call it placemaking. It became a place and they all could identify with that. And so people from the other houses came out, they brought photo albums of when the houses were being built. It was like a reunion. And so as they were driving, they got back in the car and he said, do you still want to go to the school? She said, no, I know these people, it'll be fine. And so what was interesting to me is that process, that iterative process. They were probably nervous going into the neighborhood as a group. The group didn't really want outsiders. What would they know? But over time, they got to know each other, and it transformed both of their ideas about what was possible and what the other person was like by just working with them, right? And so I think it's that engagement process brings ownership. The co-creation process brings ownership. Just to jump maybe one more step, I would say the other thing, so that works if you're involved, but what happens after you leave? And so I would say, William, to your project in Johns Creek, that park, that tunnel that was built, that became artified, if you will, it really was a tunnel that even if you weren't a part of the process, you can now see a physical change. It is a physical place. And the work of other people in the community created a place that even though I wasn't there when it was created, I can see that it was a place that the community was interested in. They keep it, they maintain it. And it broke down the barriers between two parts of town and became a place. And so there is that placemaking, that kind of process is both twofold. There's the actual process of creating and building, but then what is it we leave behind? Have we left behind changed lives, changed places? And I think all of that is important in terms of the transformative process.
So Steve, obviously, that's why he's on this panel. You can see his urban planning hat on, and participatory practices. I guess he's really the guru on that. He helped us as well make more sound processes. So I think, to Grace's question, one of the answer could be we should all take an urban planning degree here. The other perspective could be that obviously that's why I think we need to have intersectional, hybrid, interdisciplinary conversations, and not only conversations, but projects, because this is how we can get rid of these silos and expedite the knowledge between ourselves on community-based practices, right? Whether we're artists or institutions. But to Steve's point also, he spoke about the idea of creating a place and how art can be that, right? Because of this participatory process, art can become this place for all the broken and not broken hearts in the community. And then he also spoke about the continuity. It's not only about the process of creating the piece, but it's also what is after, right? How are we ensuring that this, whatever we're co-creating, stays there, and it is still part of his identity, of his whatever the city or community dreams about. And again, I think that comes back to William. William, what are your answers to this?
Yeah, I think I have way too many. I could go on for a long time, so I'll try to keep it short and sweet. And if anyone wants elaboration, like email me. But for the artists, like kind of like Steve shared in his story, like just show up. You're never gonna feel equipped. You're never gonna feel like this is my job. This is my comfort zone. Especially when you work with community, like it's just like the thought of it is scary. Yet when you get there, you relate to people. There's just something about being present with people that kind of, well, I showed up, like, let's do this thing. And when it comes to the learning curves and like Grace asked in her question, hopefully I've been talking about this all week. Like I want to put myself in positions with projects that scare the crap out of me, so that like I'm alert and I'm alive and I'm not like a blob of like, hey, I've done this before. And that comes with the doubts that get stuck in your head that you just kind of got to barrel through by just doing it. Like I didn't start with a thorough, organized plan, procedure, whatever. I started by showing up to a place where I knew people congregated, and I showed up with a box of art, and I was like, y'all, I know you probably haven't done this in 30 years. Like, let's make stuff and see what happens. And that's what birthed one of our first big like community pieces, like 200 people involved. It just was showing up. And since then, like with Johns Creek, I've been able to get connected and build relationships with people who have the side of the brain that can wrap around the idea of organization and timelines and procedures that help assist my process in getting places and making sure people show up. So like I'd say, other than kind of like barreling through all of the psychological impediments that keep you from just giving it a shot, showing up, engaging with people, trying, is like team up with people who have some of the strengths that you might not. And that's okay. Like we're artists. That's why we're not speechwriters. That's why we're not politicians. That's why we're not doing other things. So like, let's partner up with people who are better at that and let them help us organize.
I'd like to speak to it just, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I'm pointing to you, please.
Yeah.
No, but one of the things that I think the role of an artist should play, like, I'm not saying you have to be, you are the creator, but I think in terms of when you go into, say you go into a neighborhood that you're not familiar with, where you may feel uncomfortable, it's a part of doing that due diligence and speaking to those neighbors, that community, and saying, what is it that you want to see? If I create this, does this make sense to you? Communication, like bridge, that helps to me bridge the gap, because there have been pieces that have gone up that felt violent in certain communities that felt displaced in certain communities. So it's like, I think it's a part of also whether whoever is the partner in bringing that money in that mural or that public art to a space, the artist should do their work and also saying, but does this belong here? Is there, maybe do some research in that of that land and say what belongs in this space? I think the artist has a role in playing that to build on the community.
That's such a good point. If I could just say, like, if I had to add anything to my experiences, like, listen and don't think, kind of like the first question I answered was like, I don't try to achieve change. I don't go to a place, like, there's enough white men who've gone into places thinking that they have the right way and just been way off. So listen and be open-handed. Be open-handed to know that you don't know. And that's not the point of it. Like, the point is to put ingredients and creativity into a pot and see what cooks up.
Right.
You brought, both of you, very interesting perspectives. I mean, you, William, spoke more on the growth mentality, sort of being comfortable with the uncomfortable. And whenever going into the community, or always coming in with respect towards that community and allowing them to tell us what we should know and what their stories are before we even think about creating anything, right? And I mean, I attest, even myself thinking that I know this stuff, I've learned from William quite a bit because he is the listener here. I think he's one of the best listeners that I've ever experienced within the art world and beyond. So definitely, I think rather than jumping to conclusions, which I think all of us who are cerebral like to do that, it's sort of stepping back and listening and pausing from coming with any sort of conclusion for sometimes not only for days, but weeks, right? Or months in the complex communities. And then you, Lauren, have emphasized how this is a responsibility of the artist to learn about the community, both through direct and indirect research, before taking any ownership on creation of any sort of creative product. So definitely both of you, very, very interesting perspectives. And I'm looking also at the time. So I'm thinking now this is a good time to jump into the data. And I'm going to Jessica because I know Jessica has emphasized that this is not as much, I mean, you think that you're not as much working with communities. Now, that's a different thing, that it's an interesting thing to tackle moving forward. But I think you as an artist, I remember, I mean, the picture I have of you in general is obviously the collaboration with the United Nations in 2018, when you and Sebastian and Grace actually, who is here with us, helped us to select you actually as one of the artists. So thank you, Grace. She's definitely speaking about community leaders. Well, Grace is the one. So basically, I remember you so well that, you weren't as sure about this idea. You thought it's a little bit crazy. Both our partners at UN also thought we're out of our mind. Yet we've done it. You have created, you have used your art installation that was data-driven, computational art piece, and you've positioned what we called art as a solution to climate change, as a solution next to science, technology, innovation. So the typical, institutions that would play a role at the UN in science and technology innovation forum, right? So you were the first or the only artist that actually had a role there. And actually, beyond just speaking, you have illustrated your art installation, right? The computational art piece that was speaking to climate change. Now, I don't know whether you realize it or not, but you not only impacted the member states as in governments, nation states, but you also impacted civil societies and nonprofits. And you also actually, through that engagement, impacted what we call the outcome document. So this policy of policies that, spread into the high-level political forum for the Geeks Out There in UN. That means, the highest thing at UN. So in other words, you impacted the decision-making process at UN and in how they see the artists, to the point that now UN works more with artists, right? So can you tell us how you use science and technology in your computational art? how you bridge the two, and how do you create this impact? You have unpacked a little bit about that before, but I'm curious if you can go deeper.
Yeah, sure. I think that digital or computational art is really like uniquely situated to visualize data. And I think that there's a lot of very, very important data that can be maybe communicated in a different way through artwork. I think that, reading scientific papers and doing that sort of research is, it can be alienating to a lot of people, and the audience for that can be pretty limited. And so for example, for the installation that we took to the UN event, for that one, to give you a description, we have this field of particles that follows the tributaries of the Mississippi River watershed. And it's sort of this like slow moving, beautiful sort of ambient animated artwork on a screen. But then we also had a motion tracking sensor, so that when somebody comes in front to take a look at the piece, then you start to see these rivers become the person that's there and follow the person and sort of obscures the river watershed and shows the person's activity. And so what our goal there was, if we can show this interesting information in the context of an interaction that has this sort of physical element to it, I think that what we can do is take something that's maybe hard to engage with, some particularly scientific information that's hard to engage with, and have have a very subjective experience with that information. And so the goal is to make connections between our physical actions and the surrounding ecosystem. So it's not it's different because it's not an advocacy piece that has a strong, has a very direct message. You don't walk away from that with an agenda about climate change. But what that does do is it offers a foundational experience that simulates this different
humans have on the natural ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. And so the goal is to cultivate this connection between the individual and the ecosystem. And honestly, the way I thought about that was most people develop these values through direct experiences with nature. And so then my sort of next question in the creative process is, well, in order to help people cultivate that sort of experience, can that be digitally simulated? It's is there a way that we can do something that's not that, but that might be a similar kind of interaction that can lay the groundwork for shifting views, I guess.
So you have spoken to some very complex ideas out there, because data is never easy, but as many other things. So you were speaking about how you connect data and science and how you transfer some of these complex scientific facts into an art piece that somehow engages us through this playfulness of the technology and, of course, the aesthetics of the art. And it helps us push a little bit closer to the problem, right? Now, I'm curious if you have any recommendations to the governments as well as private sector in how they should engage with computational art, right? Because, if I think about Singapore, they're doing a fantastic job. Now, here in the US, we're somehow a little bit novice in the computational art engagement with the public and for behavioral change, let's say. So I'm curious, what would be some of your recommendations as a computational artist?
I've got practical ideas and I've got more higher level ideas, I guess. For a practical thing, Lord, we have so many digital billboards that we could make some of that available for a different kind of visual presentation. There's a lot of opportunity with sort of practical spaces and opportunities like that. But I think that, and especially for businesses and organizations, I feel like sometimes there's an absence of support because the value isn't very explicit, because people might think of artwork as something that just like makes the ambience nicer or something like that. So I think that if there was a clear understanding that there's a potential partnership between, say, the core values of an organization and the concept of an art piece, that makes for a persuasive situation, that I think that can basically be a route of logic that's used to advocate for more art, is to say, like, this can appeal to our values as an organization. And so if we think about this sort of earlier in the developing process instead of like icing on the cake, then it can actually help build a space that also reflects an organization's values, you know?
So that's a very interesting perspective. And actually, that really helps me connected to Steve now, because I think, Steve, you have worked in the global setting for a while. And not only that, I think if I think from a United Nations perspective, in 2016, Agenda 2030 was created. And for those who don't know, it's the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. So this is basically the time when at the negotiation table, finally, there weren't just the member states, but there were the activists, there were the nonprofits, there were the local governments. So everybody played their role in the negotiation, to the point that we came up with this agenda that actually, quote unquote, in a way, position what we call now sustainability. It started back in 2016, I can say even earlier with negotiation. But finally now, even the business community, public sector, everybody speaks sustainability, right? It's a buzzword out there. So, but what that impacted is our way of thinking, because I remember that not only impacted my generation, but many others in thinking, okay, wait a minute, can we as a business or nonprofit actually be focused on more on the sustainable output, sustainability, and create more social impact? Now I'm thinking from an arts perspective, from your perspective, Steve, you know, do you think that there is a chance to sort of, in a way, mirror that perspective of bringing the different stakeholders to the table? That's one thing, but also creating a new creative industry infrastructure, one that it's more attuned to the complex problems of the world, whether that's climate change, social justice, you know, sustainable consumption, you name it, right? Can we also reframe the creative industry and become more connected with the planetary issues? So, Steve, a complex problem for you.
Yeah, I mean, you raise an interesting question. I think that I'd still go back to all politics are local. So I think you have to engage people where they are to move them to a place where we can actually connect with each other outside. When Katrina happened, there was a musicians village, all the jazz musicians. They had some houses rebuilt, and there was a playground that was built, and they connected in the playground, there was a phone and you could pick it up and the kids could call someone halfway around the world in another playground. And it was their attempt to try to connect what happened in Katrina with another place that had a disaster. So there was an intentional kind of outreach. And I think what I like about the SDGs, so there's the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 different goals. And so it's pretty easy, wherever you live, whatever your issue is, you can find your issue in those 17 goals. There's 169 metrics. You can even find the thing you want to measure and contribute.
Yeah.
And they have both a national report that's done, it's obligated by the UN, but there's now some 30 or 40 cities that have developed their own voluntary report of what they're doing in their city to be more sustainable, which the arts community could join, right? So if Atlanta has one, New York has one, the artists can join, and that art can be a part of what it is they report on and how they get those metrics and how they make the sustainability goals more real. So I think there are ways to tie in. I would say what's more exciting for me is the new urban agenda. So in a way, the SDGs are sort of a pile of metrics, and they were the metrics. They didn't want to disappoint everyone. So anything that any lobby group threw in, they, included it. But the new urban agenda tried to say, this is all great, but what does the city of 2030 look like? What does the city of 2050 look like? And it's that picture that the narrative that we've been talking about through the day. What's the narrative of Atlanta in 2030 and 2050, right? What do we want that to look like? Well, that takes someone with creativity, and artists can play a huge role in being a leader in that conversation. I mean, I like the participatory aspect of it. Einstein famously said that creativity is contagious. We should spread it around. If we just reach out, we can expect our neighbors to be creative and help us understand how we can be what it is that we as a community decide it is that we want to be. And I think who else is more creative than artists that can help us reimagine or visualize what that looks like? That would be such a cool thing. Maybe we should try to start that in Atlanta.
Wonderful. And I know that Nisa is pinging me out there that, hey, we have some time that we need to bring the Q&A back. But before we jump in the Q&A portion, I want to raise a last question for all the panelists. And this is, I know that somehow more futuristic, but maybe not. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we're in the fourth industrial revolution, whether we want it or not. That's what World Economic Forum said years ago. They're reinstating it this year as well. So what that means is that technology is becoming the sort of, the absolute, crucial imperative, right, for the decades to come, whether we want it or we don't want it. Now, me coming from a developing country, I do see technology as a wonderful thing, because I cannot imagine being in front of you today, if not due to internet. I mean, in the most sort of bluntly, post perspectives, this is how I got my scholarship at Oxford Brookes thanks to internet. And also this is how I've learned about the fellowship in US, and that's what brought me here, right? Without internet, I wouldn't have been here. Maybe this conversation would haven't happened, at all. So obviously, I'm very optimistic when it comes to the role of technology in this. But through my experiments in Atlanta, especially if we speak about marginalized communities, they see technology not as positive or positive lights. And that might be because they see it through the lenses of corporations or some lenses of things that did not work so well in the past, but they don't necessarily see it as an empowerment tool, right? So the question for all of you is, how do you think we can overcome this misunderstanding of technology, whether that's artificial intelligence, blockchain, IoT, whatever you want to call it, to integrate it in the cultural framework so that we can accelerate the impact even more, right? So if we've heard from William how process is very important, and definitely technology cannot replace the process of including other people, for sure. But from Jessica's perspective, and also Steve's, we've heard that technology can, however, help us either make it bigger, connect it, make it more physical, help people understand some complex issues a bit faster, because beyond the aesthetics, there is also data that measures some of the impact, right? So it can help us, the geeks out here, to measure what we want to measure. So, and help the communities also learn about themselves. So the question for you all is, how do you see this integration of technology, right? How can we surpass this misunderstanding? How can we integrate the technology in the cultural frameworks to accelerate the change? Of course, for all of you, it's for the artist from an artist perspective. For Lauren, is more from an institutional perspective. So I'm speaking obviously equity here, and Steve from a systems perspective. So
I think you make a good point that for some communities, technology is dangerous and different tools have been used against people. And thinking about our direct experiences informing our values so much, it only naturally follows, that a lot of people would not feel safe with different aspects of applying applications of technology. And it seems that to me, it has to do with a couple of different things. And one is understanding the capacity of tools. I think this is something that'll change over time as we have a sort of ambient understanding of what is and isn't possible with different tools. But also at the same time, I don't think that communities and individuals who feel uncomfortable with higher levels of technology, I feel like the most persuasive opportunity is real regulation. And I think we're living in like the Wild West of data right now. And so many crazy practices are going on, and they're so opaque and difficult to understand that there's no wonder there's a culture of some degree of fear. And I think real regulation must happen. And until then, I think transparency and also hardline commitments from different organizations and groups about making their values explicit and making a commitment to their users, not just something that sounds nice, but a real commitment, because that's all we have between the Wild West and one day when we get reasonable regulation that protects people. It's volatile, I think.
So I agree with all those things.
Systemic issues. Go ahead, Steve.
I would just build on that just really quickly and say that, you think about the evolution, they call it the fourth industrial revolution, this evolution to internet and social media. And you think about, well, it started with, Corazon Aquino came into power through the text revolution. They were trying to police the protesters, but they texted each other and said, be in this square in 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. And thousands of people poured out, and the police weren't prepared. And then we had the Arab Spring, right? Same thing. They tweeted where they were supposed to meet. And so there are ways that in the beginning, it's been a great thing. It's democratized information and kind of leveled the playing field in so many ways. But you look at this last election, and you look what social media has done, then Jessica's exactly right. We need to be better consumers of data, better consumers of information. We need to learn how to triangulate what it is we're reading and sort of test that. If we were, if I went to a bar and sat down at a table and had a few drinks with somebody, I'd look them across the table and I'd sort of try to figure out, is this guy for real or not? That's really hard to do on social media, especially when the algorithms connect you with someone that thinks just like you, So I do think that there is, in the US, we're so First Amendment friendly, but it's not true in Europe and Asia and other places. So it's much more regulated in other places around the world than it is in the US. So I think it's going to be a challenge for us, where it'll push us. That creative tension between community good and individual freedom is something we're going to have to struggle with in a way a lot of other cultures, it's not an issue. Mm-hmm. So it is a Wild West. We are at the beginning of taming the Wild West. Jessica's right.
Good luck to us. Okay, Lauren.
So to me, technology means access. One of the biggest ways I saw the issue with that is, just giving the example of moving to home life. I live in Gwinnett County. My kids go to a top elementary school. I'm grateful for that. But then I have friends that are educators in, Clayton County, Riverdale County, and they, my son had the option to bring home a computer, right? They offered, hey, do you want him to have this, Lenovo computer, this laptop? I'm like, no, we have something. I'm blessed to, that he has access to something here. But I'm like, where they had issues where they didn't hear our students show up in class. Because they didn't have something that they could access. They didn't have a computer. They didn't have, a printer to print out their work. And it made me feel extremely privileged because I have a printer. I have an extra computer for them to use. I have an extra tablet, thank God. But there are communities out there that did not have access to education for months because communities could not provide that. And so to me, it's the same thing as institutional wise. When you think of art, it's still just access. Like, if you want to learn about art, why don't they have computers to just Google who Renoir is, who Pablo Picasso is, what's going on in their own community? To me, it's access. So there's inner city communities who don't have access to technology to expand their learning and their knowledge. And that's how I see it. So when you think of an institution or I think I gave you an example before, Ruxanda, about I went to the Muséum d'Orsay in Paris, and as soon as you walk in, they give you the option to have a headset and to have a headset and like a QR thing scanned. You can scan it to where you can go to the artwork, scan it, and it reads to you the story behind the artwork, right? So even if you can't relate or you don't even know what you're looking at, if you're not an art history student, you can at least learn while you're there without having to ask a question, to not feel intimidated in that space about learning what that art is. Every institution that, to me, displays artwork needs to have something like that for somebody to be able to hear and learn, even if they don't have a connection to the art world. To me, I just think of access when I think of technology. And that's one of the examples that I think of.
That's beautiful. And lastly, but not least, William, and then we'll jump into Q&A. I promise you, Nisa. I feel the pressure now. Go ahead, William. You're on mute.
Thank you. I was saying, let's just jump into Q&A. Technology is overwhelming to me. I mean, that's why I like to just be in my cold studio making sparks and dust, and like if I don't sweat, I just get ornery. So like I'm a very hands-on person. If anything, I'm trying to regulate and moderate my technology consumption. And I will leave the ways to help give equal access and utilize it as a force for good to those who like speak that language.
Wonderful. It seems like we need to do some workshop between you and Jessica more. So on this topic, that would be cool. Speaking about how we accelerate the knowledge democratization with Grace is speaking about in the chat. So Nisa, you take it from here.
Well, thank you so much. I want to speak a little bit to what Lauren was talking about as it relates to access. I think when COVID-19 became a real threat for people and museums had to close last March, their initial response was to utilize technology. But in doing though, they disenfranchised people who didn't have access to not only tablets, but Wi-Fi, or whose home situations weren't conducive for learning or creating in the first place. And I think that was the biggest failure for institutions in trying to keep up with the Joneses. They failed the Joneses. They truly did. So I would love to pivot. Waduda has been having a great conversation in the chat. And she says, I think it might be helpful to know that Georgia historically is 50th and 49th of the states in terms of funding for the arts. This affects what organizations receive in funding and what they're able to do, and challenges them to make decisions regarding projects. Remember, Georgia arts funding was cut by 80% almost 10 years ago. This is a lot of work to do to move the Georgia arts industry forward. So I'm going to pivot to her question, which she asked earlier, which was activism equals awareness, advocacy equals policy changes. Affecting communal change takes a top-down approach. As artists or arts professionals, what are you doing to affect policy changes that can lead to the funding and community engagement through the arts that you want to see? Are you engaging with elected officials in addition to continuing your work?
So I'm going to say I listen to Waduda and whatever she says for me to do, as you see. So when she talks about policy and advocacy, I go to her. In terms of the state level, if there's governmental level, I refer to Waduda. But in terms of with my organization, Black Women Visual Art, eventually, we will have to go to the policy level. And going into working with the National Endowment for the Arts, working with Americans for the Arts, working with Georgians for the Arts, in terms of where can we find equity in the workplace for Black women to get a seat at the table, right? Eventually, we will have to go a little further than just providing jobs, providing opportunities. There's a larger issue at play, not even just within our own city, but nationally and internationally, because it's an issue with colleagues that I know that are in London, that are in Paris, that are in Hong Kong. It's an issue everywhere in terms of diversity and equity in the arts. But policy is one of the biggest changes I think we can make, getting our change makers involved in the arts and making sure they know the importance that art plays in our community.
I definitely second what Laura mentions. Yeah. Who is next? I don't want to take over.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, all I can think is I need to start listening to folks you're listening to, Lauren. I'm not doing enough, because when I think about engagement with representatives, I'm not there for that. I'm not active enough, So I would say
You have positioned your art that you want, so you.
I know. I was going to say that's yeah. Anywhere I can make art present in these sorts of institutions. That's how I try. But yeah, I could step up a lot more.
And to Grace, sorry.
Oh, no. Nisa, go for it.
I was going to say, to Grace's comment earlier, part of it's also figuring out what skill set you need in order to be able to connect with those people. And Steve mentioned there are these kind of organizations or businesses and groups that need to do the inviting. The onus is not on the artist to facilitate these conversations and to facilitate these relationships all the time. So it is definitely not a full 100% responsibility on you. They also have to be meeting you where you're at as well and doing that work. And I guess part of that's also, how do institutions make that happen? How do we form better partnerships so that the artist doesn't have to do all the work on top of the art? But William,
these organizations. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Was that a question?
It can be. Go ahead.
But I was just saying, one of the examples in terms of community efforts is with Heather Infantry leading this conversation with Community Foundation recently, right? Having to create equity with their application pool in terms of giving grants and money to Black arts organizations. That just happened this year I don't know the exact number, but it was a lot. They've gotten over $2.8 million, I think, in terms of the last 6 months, just by her creating the conversation around, no, there is no equity here. Black arts organizations and Black artists are being left out of this grant process because of the application questions and because of the requirements in the application, and they don't serve organizations that are smaller and Black led. That conversation changed their application process, their questions that they gave, the requirements that they gave, and now there's $2.8 million going back into the Black arts economy here in Atlanta. That, to me, we have to be the voices but organizations also have to do the work intentionally. One of the conversations that came up in the panel that she hosted was, they were like, well, we didn't know where to look. Why? How? You're in Atlanta. Why aren't there program managers in your organization who are doing the work to go into the community to find who's doing the work, and even not just from the bigger guy, but from the little guy? There has to be intention behind these organizations doing community work and not just sitting at their desk. They have to go find it and have to go find those individuals and artists and organizations who are really doing good work.
And I think that speaks to the racist framework that a lot of these organizations are coming from. And when we talk about infrastructure, well, the racist framework is, well, you have to have this many people as a full-time staff member. Well, most of these Black organizations don't have the funding to pay a staff member in the first place. So although they have been able to sustain a 30-year career in the arts with a robust community engagement focus, they just don't have that. And I think that's something that it's unfortunate, but they also need to do the diversity, equity, and inclusion training so that their inherent bias and racism is not present when giving this money and when giving these opportunities. So I want to pivot to a question that another participant or audience member had, which is from William B. from Canada. He says, "Hello, everyone. I'm grateful for you all sharing your truth as well as your incredible work in the community. Thank you so much. In your opinion, how might your practice evolve once the COVID-19 pandemic has passed?"
When is that going to happen?
Right, when is this ending?
Are you asking for my 10-year plan?
Yeah.
That's so hard to know. Honestly, I can just say, I don't know. I'm sure, obviously, I'm being affected by this as much as anyone else. And it's baffling and tiring. And I think through struggle produces ingenuity and creative solutions. But to forecast what they might be, I couldn't tell you. Maybe I'll make out of everyone's old masks. Maybe I'll make something. I don't know.
Oh, come on, William. A little bit more hopeful. Well, I seem to be getting ready. Steve, why don't you go?
Well, I would just say that, in the circles that I'm in, where we talk to funders, donors, foundations, that we can make a much more compelling case now about COVID has just actually laid bare systemic problems that have been around a long time.
Yeah.
So there are families that didn't have food. Well, they've never had food. I mean, that's always been an issue, right? Their kids couldn't go to school. They've always not been able to go to school. The girls turn puberty age and they start menstruating and they lose a week at school all around the world. Well, that's been like that for 1,000 years, So, but COVID has made it more real, more clear, more prescient. And so maybe the question is, how do we as community development artists engaged in the community, how do we jump in and say, yes, we can help solve this problem. We want to be a part of helping to solve the problem. And I really believe that the creative community has a role to play to help make this narrative more real to people. I think Jessica would agree that her numbers are great in her computational art, but it's the actual visual piece that catches people's attention, right? You need the numbers as background, but you need the creative visual part that captures people's attention to change the narrative. So I think it's a good time to push, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think COVID-19 laid bare to our issues more than ever. In education, in the arts, in job equity. I think it literally put America on Front Street. And I'm thankful for that because, regardless of, I don't want anybody to be in pain and be in lack any sources, but it's like, but now you see there's a larger issue. It's not just, yes, it was the president for sure that caused issues. But now we still have to move within our own communities, and we still have so much work to do. But I don't think that what I want people to charge people with is that you have a role to play. You don't have to play every single role. Like whatever role you have to play in your community, do that and do it well, and try to be a voice to bridge whatever inequity there is in your own community. But yeah, I feel like after post-COVID and after all of this, I don't know if there is an after. I think we just evolved. I don't think there is something to move on to. I think we just evolved, and now it's like, okay, this is a new step. Now we see all this. Flint still has dirty water. Y'all, like there's so much. There's still so much that we have to do just to start with the bigger issues. So, just from, people that lack homes, like Atlanta has a huge issue with that. Like, why are they shutting down shelters and then they're complaining about them being on the street? Like, there's issues at play. And so it's just like, there's just too much. So post-COVID, I hope that we are more humane, and I hope that we address issues that are larger than just the arts, but people as a whole.
Lauren, that's wonderful what you said, because I think you re-emphasize the fact that we all, absolutely all, panelists, non-panelists, the viewers, audience, the people, we all play a role in advocacy and activism, all of us, right? And we are the ones that create our future, basically. And we need to think how we're using our skills to repurpose this. And also, I'm curious, because since we're kind of stepping into the action side, what would be some of the action items that we all want to take on this panel? Because I think that's a piece that we did not discuss about. And we really want to leave this panel with not only being energized and having examples, but also in a way, being accountable for pushing some of these ideas forward in our community or beyond. It can be local to global. Like all of you mentioned, a lot of the problems we face here, they are not only here, unfortunately, they are everywhere around the world. So what if we collaborate community to community from a global perspective, right? And just one comment, since Steve mentioned a little bit about how COVID has just illustrated some of the problems that already existed. I can make a case that technology is doing the same. Because if there are some biases in technology, that doesn't mean the technology is biased. It means that people are, and our society is. So that's some of the things that I think technology and COVID have in common. But anyhow, yeah, from that, we're speaking about the action items. So who wants to start?
Well, just because lately I've been thinking a lot about the capacity for art to help all of us process the different variety of overwhelming feelings that we've been experiencing, like in whatever way. I think that there's either culturally or individually across the board, lots of different forms of grief. And I think that there are ways that we can, are ways that I want to use my art practice and technology in order to say, how do we process that together? How do we come back together after we've been alone for so long? And I think that art can help us do that. And so that's where my head's at.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. Well, William, I see you nodding, so.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's like, this is why I love community so much, is that with this question and the last, y'all's answers kind of helped me to realize that things are shifting inside of me and leading to change, whether I'm aware of them or not. And I guess, yeah, I mean, like everyone was saying, it's like the only surprising thing that the pandemic, well, there were lots of surprising things. A main surprising thing that the pandemic unveiled is that, like, the world's, the greatest country in the world is not that, it doesn't have its shit together, which was no surprise to me. So I guess it's like, what are we going to do different in the future? It's like nothing. I already felt like we were more disconnected than we ought to be, and we desperately need connection, and that there are people that we see every day that are almost like shackled by unseen forces that we must unlock through the way we live and engage. And I guess action items would be double down, and rest and take care of yourself so that you're equipped to do the work. I'm not sure why or how it fits in, but I think of the work that Love Beyond Walls has done during the pandemic, which is started with just hand washing stations. And it's like, well, for sure we needed to wash our hands before the pandemic. And for sure, people who are experiencing homelessness couldn't. And for sure, they don't have bathrooms on every corner, public restrooms for anyone who needs to take a pee walking down the street can access. And all of that existed before the pandemic. Well, now we're just doing something because it's in our faces and we've got to. So for me, doubling down on community connection and making sure that the art represents the people who are around it and the people who are unseen. If I can make something 20 feet tall that represents someone unseen that's 5 feet tall, then yes, I'm going to show their value and their worth. So I guess this is all just kind of adding fuel to the purpose and the reason and the meaning why I do anything, and hopefully why we make efforts to create good things in this world.
William, Steve, I see that you're getting ready.
I'm just watching all the chats. It sounds like there's 3 or 4 organizations that are actively sort of promoting their cause. I think there's a forum out there, and maybe it's great that maybe this conversation has helped to push people together a little bit. And I think that COVID is an opportunity maybe for the arts community and the organizations in the arts community to sort of maybe come together and see if we can take advantage as a group.
Yeah. Like that.
I was just going to say, I was going to say that action item can be really just in terms of your partnerships out of your comfort zone, like I said earlier, and making sure we're holding the community the artists and people involved accountable for what type of content we're putting out, and making sure that you're bringing people to the table that are not in your own circle, and really reaching out beyond your safe zone. So I think that to me is important. And also making sure you have enough money to pay those involved, especially if they're Black women, Black people, especially since Black History Month is coming. Don't hire Black people to do something for this month just because. Do it all year round. And making sure not just Black people, but all races and backgrounds coming together. So, yeah. And
I hope, to your point, Lauren, I hope that you all set us accountable on the diversity of our panels. Obviously, we are, as you can see already, there's a myriad of backgrounds at the table today, but this is just the beginning. And I think with each panel, we hope to be more and more, intentional of who we're bringing at the table. So we definitely are looking forward to all of you to recommend speakers. You have heard that the next one will be more climate change. It probably will be more a partnership with UN. But even for that one, as well as the next ones, we really look forward to your recommendations. You are an active part of this series. You're not just a listener, so please speak up.
And with that said, I'm going to close this out. So thank you to the audience who's been very engaging in the chat. And then thank you to you all for showing up and giving your space and time to us, and also speaking on the authority of the things that you know about. I think, again, to what Ruxanda said, the next step is us to be doing the work. And so we will meet as a partnership, and we will figure out what we can do to create an infrastructure that can be built on top of what we already have, and to engage more community members and community organizations. So with that said, have a great Saturday, and I hope to speak to you all soon and at the next panel. Bye.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for coming.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.